I wanted to know, can AI help us decide what's the best camera to buy? Well, let's see. What's shaking bacon? I'm Joanie Simon. Welcome to my studio. So I recently asked ChatGPT, what camera should I buy? Granted, I could have maybe asked with a better prompt, but here's what it gave me as a response. And I gotta say, this is a good start, but there's some misleading and some missing information here. And there's a lot more to say on the topic so that you can make the right decision for you. So let's go through these various points so that you can feel more well-equipped to choose a camera. So very first point that they make is intended use. How do you plan to use the camera? Is this for casual photography, professional work? Do you want it for travel, sports, landscape, portraits, low light photography? Feels a little random in that mix, but I think this is a little misleading because it's implying that there is a best camera for travel, a best camera for landscape, maybe a best camera for food photography, when in reality, most modern DSLR and mirrorless cameras can do all of these photography types well. There isn't something magical about one model over another that makes it particularly well suited to food photography. Different cameras do have different added features that might be valuable to you as a photographer, but here's the problem, is if you're watching this video, I imagine that maybe you are just starting out, and so you're not gonna know what features are important to you yet. You need to learn photography and develop the way that you like to work, and in that process, you're gonna discover the limitations that the camera that you're working with has, and it's in those limitations then that are gonna help to inform your next camera purchase. Because here's the thing, in this day and age, the speed of change in technology, even though hopefully the camera that you're gonna buy will serve you well for years to come, if you really get into photography, this is not gonna be your last camera purchase. But now one thing to keep in mind is overall that when it comes to food photography is that we actually don't need a ton of super fancy settings or features like a lot of the camera companies like to brag about. Things like super fast autofocus or the ability to capture a high number of frames per second. And maybe those features will come in play from time to time as a food photographer, but a lot of pros out there would say that they're mostly shooting in manual mode with a lot of manual settings. Food photographers, we don't really need a lot of hyphy features like someone who's capturing the photo finish at the Kentucky Derby or capturing a figure skater leaping into the air. It would be like me buying a tricked out Ferrari for getting around day to day. Sure, it could get me from one place to another, but it would be pretty overkill for my personal needs. I wouldn't be taking advantage of everything that that car has to offer, whereas a race car driver on a track could benefit from all those added features. So the good news there is that as food photographers, most modern DSLR and mirrorless cameras are going to get you to where you need to go. But just to help you out to narrow down the potential cameras that are out there, there are a few minimum base settings and features that are going to be important to food photography, especially if you're planning to potentially work for clients. So these are the 4 things that I'd make sure that your camera that you're looking at has at a minimum. So very first, I recommend going with either a DSLR or a mirrorless camera with the ability to change lenses. Now, if this is your very first camera purchase and you are not heavily invested in lenses, then I am gonna say go ahead and consider going mirrorless because that is the direction that the industry is moving in. We are now seeing developments continue in the mirrorless realm, not so much in the DSLR. So going mirrorless will be a better long-term investment and it's going to set you up well for future upgrades. So then second, I would want a minimum of 24 megapixels. That's going to give you enough resolution for most web work as well as book and magazine print work. Now we're going to talk more about megapixels in a minute. And then third, I'd want to make sure it had HD video recording at 1920 by 1080 resolution at the 24 frames per second and 30 frames per second to ensure that quality video capture in case you decide to get into video work. And it can also be super helpful to be able to have 60 frames per second at 1920 by 1080p. So that's in case you're going to want to get into doing those slow-mo B-roll shots. But now if you are more serious about video and that is something that's very important to you, then for sure 4K capabilities would be nice. Now granted, I don't usually deliver 4K work to clients personally, but that is still something that is nice to have if you get into video. And then number 4, I'd make sure it has an external external hot shoe for flash, if in the event that you are going to get into flash photography down the line. So then moving on to the next suggestion on the list from ChatGPT, how much are you willing to spend? Cameras come in a wide variety of prices, from a few $100s to several $1,000s. And this is also one of my favorite questions to ask somebody when they're considering a camera purchase, especially if this is your first serious camera, because setting a limit for yourself is going to help you narrow down your options. And you can get a great quality entry-level camera that can be used professionally for less than $1,000. And you can actually save even more money going with a quality used camera. In fact, the camera that started my business and that still works great here 8 years later, I bought it used from B&H for $500. That included both the camera and the lens and the battery. And I gotta say that B&H is my personal go-to retailer for both new and used equipment because they provide a solid warranty, money-back guarantee, plus outstanding customer service. And when we're talking specifically about used gear, it's really nice to know that the outfit you're buying from has the expertise in refurbishment and repair to ensure that your used equipment is in great condition, because purchasing from private parties means you are going without any sort of guarantees or protections, so buyer beware. So the next consideration recommended by ChatGPT is size and portability. Do you want a small compact camera that you can easily carry with you, or are you willing to carry a larger, heavier camera for better image quality and more advanced features? And so this is where I raise my eyebrows a little bit, because I think that ChatGPT is misleading us here a bit, that a heavier camera is not a better camera for better image quality. Now, yes, a DSLR mirrorless camera is going to provide higher resolution images, the ability to change a lens for sharper shots compared to a small point and shoot camera. But take, for example, my trusty Canon 5D Mark IV that I used for years in my business. It served me incredibly well. That if I compare it to the Canon R, which is Canon's compatible mirrorless camera, newer camera, that these are both very similar though in terms of specs, though the R does have a few more extra bells and whistles owing to the fact that it's just newer technology, but they're both going to put out very comparable quality in terms of images, even though the R weighs 660 grams versus the 800 grams of the 5D Mark IV. But to that point, the heavier camera is not the better camera. What I will say though is it's really helpful to put your hands on the camera you're going to be buying first, just to see how it feels in your hands. And if you're especially going to be somebody who's going to be traveling with your gear, or you're going to be shooting on location, you might want to opt for something that is smaller, more compact, easier to carry. So consider the size from the standpoint of your own use and comfort, but don't use it as an indicator of image quality. So next recommended consideration from ChatGPT is the type of camera. That there are many types of cameras, including DSLR, mirrorless, point and shoot, action cameras. Each has its own advantages and disadvantages. That is very nebulous. And this is though echoing somewhat of what we talked about in terms of that intended use. My suggestion is that if you're a content creator or a blogger and you are happy with what your phone is capturing, keep rocking that phone. Upgrading just because FOMO is never a good enough reason. But if you're looking to serve clients, or you're looking for additional control over the capture of your photos and videos, then consider a mirrorless or DSLR camera. So next recommendation from ChatGPT is asking about image quality. Do you want a camera with high resolution, good dynamic range, and low noise in low light situations? So like I recommended earlier, 24 megapixels, that's gonna be plenty enough for most purposes in taking photos for yourself and for clients. Now, granted, in time, your needs might change, in which case you can rent gear that would address the specific higher resolution needs you need. Personally, for me though, having worked professionally since 2015, I haven't needed much more than that. Now, more megapixels is not a bad thing, but they are not the end all be all. And if you are not familiar with what a megapixel is or why they're important, I have a previous video for you to check out, linked down below. Now, as far as dynamic range, this is one of those instances of a feature that may not actually be important to you. This is where it comes into play when shooting outdoors, because any camera has a limited range from dark to light that it can capture, where like the human eye, we can see what's happening in a dark shadow simultaneously to being able to see the brightness of the clouds in the sky. But our camera can't capture that full range of brightness. For example, in this image, we can see the subject and the shadow areas, but the sky is completely blown out because there is too much dynamic range from the subject to the brightness brightness of the sky, whereas a camera with a high dynamic range can capture details in both the brightest and darkest areas of the scene, resulting in a more balanced and detailed photo. And this is obviously going to make sense if you're doing a lot of outdoor portraits in natural light, or if you're a sports photography outdoors, but a lot of food photography is happening indoors with either natural light or artificial within a limited spectrum of brightness. And so for me, I don't really care about high dynamic range personally. But then there's low light situations, and this is something that is potentially more applicable to us as food photographers, that when camera brands tout the performance of a camera in low light situations, they're talking about how well it handles noise when shooting at higher ISO settings. Now, if you're not familiar with what ISO is, definitely check out the previous video I have linked down below. Essentially, a lot of newer cameras brag about the fact that they have minimal grain at high ISO settings, which is nice if you are shooting in darker conditions like indoors at the end of the day or in a dark restaurant. That said, it's not super important to me personally, again, because I'm often shooting artificial light, and so I'm not even really relying on the ISO for my exposure. And if I find myself shooting in natural light or inside a dark restaurant where I don't have artificial light and I need to brighten the exposure, I'm just gonna pop the camera on a tripod, slow down that shutter speed, and bring more light into the camera to get that brighter exposure. Now, if you're not familiar with all of those terms and what that means, check out my manual mode playlist down below. So is low light performance nice to have? Yes, but for me, it's not vital, and it is not something that would be a make or break decision for me in considering a camera. So next up is the lens system. Some cameras have interchangeable lenses, while others have fixed lenses. Consider availability, quality, and cost of lenses when choosing a camera. So I received some really good advice a long time ago, perhaps you've heard this too, is that it's more important to invest in quality lenses than it is to invest in quality bodies. That the lenses are going to have a bigger impact on the appearance of your photos, and I have personally found that to be true. Now, it is important to have the actual knowledge of how to properly operate your camera and understanding light and exposure, because you can have a super fancy camera, top of the line lens, but if you don't understand how to produce quality images, the camera isn't going to do the work for you. But if you do understand how to shoot in manual mode and the foundational concepts of lighting, then having quality lenses is like the icing on the cake. Like we discussed earlier, if you select a DSLR or mirrorless camera, it will have the ability for you to swap out different lenses, as opposed to like a point and shoot camera where the lens can't be swapped out. But as far as ChatGPT's recommendation to consider the availability, quality, and the cost of lenses, is that it's all going to be fairly comparable to a degree between Nikon, Canon, Sony, Fuji, Olympus, all the major camera brands. They all have quality lenses available, and all those lenses are expensive. That's just the fact of the matter, especially if you're buying new. That said, if you're going to be rocking some used gear, it is easier to find quality used Canon equipment simply based on the fact of they have the greatest market share. There's an article linked down below with some stats about the different camera brands, and nearly half of the cameras being sold this past year were Canon. And so with that widespread use means that there's just going to be a lot more resale and used equipment available. Now, one thing to keep in mind as you are making a purchase, this is super important, is that once you have committed to a manufacturer and as you start to collect lenses, it is going to be progressively harder for you to make major moves between brands later, because Canon lenses go with Canon cameras, Nikon lenses go with Nikon cameras. Now, there are adapters, but in general, it's just going to make life easier to keep everything within the same brand family. And also keep in mind that a camera's DSLR lenses aren't directly compatible with that same brand's mirrorless cameras. For example, Nikon's DSLR lenses are f-mount, whereas the new mirrorless cameras use z-mount. Now, here again, there are absolutely adapters. They work really well. So if you are heavily invested in, say, for example, Nikon f-mount lenses, you can protect that investment using an FTZ adapter if you end up going with a mirrorless camera later. But if you are brand new to the world of bodies and lenses, I would again recommend going with a mirrorless camera and that same brand's compatible lenses. So next up, ChatGPT GPT suggests researching the different brands. Different camera brands have their own strengths and weaknesses. Consider the reputation, customer support, and availability of accessories and lenses for each brand. And I will say this is a very true statement. And furthermore, there is no such thing as a perfect camera or a perfect lens. There is no one camera or lens that can be all things to all photographers. We have, again, all of our own unique needs, different kinds of jobs that might call for different kinds of things. Ultimately, all of the brands do a great job at the objective of capturing quality images, and it can be nearly impossible for most people to tell the difference between images captured between the different brands. For example, I recently borrowed some gear from our friends over at B&H, including a Nikon Z5 with a 50mm f1.8 lens and the Canon R with a 50mm f1.8 lens. And I put them in a head-to-head, capturing the scene of ingredients for a Greek pasta salad for our client Baker by Nature. So can you tell which is which? Feel free to pause it. But I gotta say, they're both very similar. Now, perhaps an expert in the different brands could really get in there and do some hard pixel peeping and tell the difference, because there are some slight variations from brand to brand in how colors specifically are handled. But ultimately, the difference is so slight, and with a few quick edits, the differences can be imperceptible. So all that to say, which camera you choose will not have a major bearing on the appearance of your images. Now, what I will say though is where brand does become relevant to discuss is in the compatibility with third-party integrations, compatibility with accessories. So for me as a food photographer, that's specifically speaking to tethering softwares like Adobe Lightroom, Capture One, Dragon Frame, and third-party lighting systems like Godox, Profoto, Westcott. Now, perhaps you will never tether or need to utilize softwares beyond the editing software, and maybe you'll forever shoot natural light. But for the sake of future potential, I do like to recommend sticking with Canon, Nikon, or Sony, because when we're talking about market share, they are the most widely used camera systems, and most softwares and third-party gear are going to be compatible with them. Two, because they are the most widely used, it's easier to find YouTube videos and tutorials and education specific to those brands. But of course, if you are super excited about Fuji or Panasonic, maybe because of a friend or a mentor or another photographer, please do not let me stop you. But now, with all this in mind, which if your head is swimming, I totally get it. We went through a lot. Here is my bottom line recommendation is I want you to go find a used mirrorless or DSLR camera that is not expensive, that meets those basic specs that we talked about, and get something that's like $500 or less for the body and a kit lens. Now, maybe you've got a little extra cash, in which case then also getting a 50mm f1.8 lens, a nifty 50 that it's gonna set you back about $150. That's just gonna allow you to shoot some wider apertures. But then with that camera, you can learn and you can make the most of that camera, because what you wanna do is to confirm that you actually like photography and you're gonna stick with it, because nothing pains me more than seeing people drop some serious cash on something that they're gonna fizzle out on within just a few months. But now you might also run into the problem that I did when I bought my first used camera, is that I believed it was the camera's fault that it was not producing great images. And I fed into the lie that if I just had a better camera, I would like my images more. But that is not true. More expensive cameras do make certain things easier to do, but they do not make better photos. So I recently started using my very first camera again, and dang, I just gotta say, she's a great camera. She is just as capable of producing awesome images like the cameras that I use today. But if you start out with a less expensive starter used camera, you're not only gonna be able to confirm that you're gonna stick with photography, but then you are in that process gonna discover what is actually important to you. What do you actually need? What are the things that you want the right camera for you to have? Because I don't have a crystal ball to know what is gonna be important to you long term, and telling you to go buy the latest and greatest full frame souped up camera based on what's important to me, that would be irresponsible. So save your money, go get yourself a great starter used camera, learn it to the best of your ability, and then make a more informed decision when you're ready to upgrade. But I just want to say big thank you to B&H for loaning me out their gear for this video, letting me play around with some different equipment, because you know, I'm a camera nerd. I love playing with gear. I also want to thank them for being an outstanding retailer that I have relied on as a professional for years. So thank you again so much to you for stopping by the the studio. Hope you got some good ideas out of this. I hope you have a fantastic day. You stay out of trouble, and I'll see you soon, okay? Bye.